The Battle of Thermopylae has become one of the most renowned battles in the history of humanity due to its numerous depictions and references in popular culture. Everybody has heard of the story of the 300 Spartans who bravely fought the mighty Persian Empire against all odds. But as a historical event largely popularized through works of fiction such as Hollywood films and video games, there are many misconceptions accepted as facts by the general public. Was the Battle of Thermopylae actually as significant as many seem to believe? Why were the Greeks fighting an outstandingly larger force against all odds? And most importantly, what actually happened at Thermopylae in 480 BC? After the Greek victory at Marathon in 490 BC, there was little debate as to whether or not this was the end of the conflict. It was clear for the Greeks that the Achaemenids were going to return to Greece, stronger and more malevolent than ever before. The debate was instead when this was going to happen, and how the peninsula needed to prepare for the inevitable upcoming Persian invasion. The victory at Marathon was an extremely significant event for the Greeks, who proved that they could stand their ground against a much superior force. Thus, morale on the Greek peninsula was high, but while Marathon was a major victory for the Greeks, the Persians viewed it only as a minor setback. Their army and fleet were still intact and vastly superior, and in their eyes, they just needed to throw more resources into another expedition into Greece in order to subdue it. Only a year after Marathon, the Athenian hero Miltiades was dead and replaced by a man named Themistocles as the most influential political figure in Athens. Themistocles would meet opposition by the Greek nobility, but his overwhelming popularity with the poor established him as a prominent figure on the Athenian political landscape. Despite the fact that the Spartans could not take part in the battle against the Persian invaders during their first expedition, Athens and Sparta were still the main cities in charge of the politics of the Greek peninsula. The Athenians focused their efforts on their navy, greatly expanding their fleet, as well as strengthening their ports and becoming a formidable naval power in the process, while the Spartans, being the most renowned warriors on the Greek peninsula, were in charge of leading the land forces. While Athens was strengthening its fleet, the Spartans took an initiative which had never before been implemented in their city. For the first time in their history, the Spartans would train and arm a part of their Hellenic population in an effort to expand their military. This move showed how seriously the Spartans took the threat posed by the Persians, since a lot of the policies of the city aimed to suppress and prevent their Hellenic population from revolting, as they made up the majority of the population in Sparta. Thus, willingly putting weapons in their hands and training them to fight would be seen as an extremely counterintuitive and dangerous measure in other circumstances. On the Persian side, Darius had the means and determination to start planning his next expedition immediately. Internal conflict within the empire, however, put a pause on his efforts, and he was forced to postpone his second invasion indefinitely after a revolt broke out in Egypt in 486. Some historians believe that there might have been a link between the Greek victory at Marathon and the later Egyptian revolt, but there is ultimately no evidence that the two events were connected besides their close proximity in time. It took the Persians 2 years to put down the revolt, but Darius' declining health and subsequent death led to an even further delay of the Persian expedition. Upon the death of Darius, the Achaemenid Empire was inherited by his son Xerxes, who was his obvious designated successor. Xerxes' main goal as a ruler was to continue the legacy of his father by slowly but steadily expanding his empire while maintaining peace among his subjects. Darius was remembered as an exceptional ruler, a capable diplomat, and an accomplished military commander with only one small blemish on his record: his failure to conquer Greece. As a new ruler, Xerxes unquestionably saw the potential invasion and subjugation of Greece, not only as an opportunity to continue the policies of his father, but also as a chance to solidify himself as a capable ruler in the eyes of his subjects. This is why shortly after the rebels in Egypt were quashed, the Achaemenid arrangements of a second expedition to Greece were resumed. Eventually, after 4 years of planning, the Persian king gathered an enormous army from all corners of his empire, and in 481 BC, it was ready to march towards Greece. It is impossible to know exactly how large Xerxes' force was. According to Herodotus, it consisted of over 2 million men, a claim which modern historians disregard as logistically impossible, and estimate that instead, the army consisted of around 100,000 soldiers and 1,000 battleships, although these numbers are highly speculative. Before launching their invasion, the Persians dispatched diplomats to Greece with their traditional demand for earth and water, symbolizing unconditional surrender to the Persian king, a custom which the Greeks were much familiar with at this point. Upon hearing that the second invasion would be led by the Persian king himself, many Greek states once again decided to submit to the Persians and pledged not to resist. The Hellenic Alliance, knowing that they would be heavily outnumbered, needed as many Greek states as possible to join their efforts. This is why the alliance led by Sparta and Athens made an agreement that after potentially repelling the Persian invasion, the Greek states which had resisted the Persians would be allowed to raise the cities of those who did not, and share the spoils between themselves. This move persuaded many smaller Greek states to join them, and eventually the Greeks managed to muster 60,000 men in land forces alongside 400 ships. The massive Persian army started slowly advancing towards Greece. The size of the army would make it impossible for the Persian troops to be transported to Greece via the sea, so a bridge needed to be built between Anatolia and Thrace so that the Persians could cross into Europe. A pontoon bridge was built at a chosen location in the Dardanelles. Persian ships were used to create a bridge from the coast of Asia to the coast of Europe. According to Herodotus, the Persians used several hundred of their ships to create a bridge which was over a kilometer long. While the details regarding the bridge's location and length are disputed by modern historians, it is safe to assume that such a bridge existed and that the Persians used a large quantity of ships for its creation. This event is significant because it represented a demonstration of power by the Persians. The fact that they were willing to effectively sacrifice hundreds of their ships only so that their massive army could cross into Europe showed how superior the empire was over the Greeks in terms of its resources and aimed to intimidate the Hellenic Alliance. Once again, the Greeks had a strong spy presence in the Achaemenid Empire and were aware of the movements of the Persian army. This gave them plenty of time to deliberate their course of action carefully and create a meticulous plan of defense. The army would take positions at Thermopylae, deploying in a narrow pass called the Hot Gates, named after the entrance to the underworld in Greek mythology. The terrain of the selected location provided an excellent defensive position for the Greeks, as its narrowness would effectively render the Persian numbers advantage useless, and give the Greek hoplites the best possible chance of repelling the overwhelmingly superior Achaemenid force. The Greek fleet would be deployed close by, at the coast of Artemisium. Its mission was to deploy at a location which would negate the Persian numbers advantage, much like the forces at Thermopylae, but also to protect their flank and prevent a Persian landing near the Greek positions. In addition to this, the close proximity of the Greek army and fleet would allow for easy communication and collaboration between all Greek forces. But even though the Greeks managed to create a sound strategic plan, they would soon run into a substantial hurdle which could considerably diminish their chances of success. As the Persian army was slowly making its way through Thrace and Macedon, it became increasingly clear that the Persians would reach Greece during the religious festival of Carneia, the same festival which had caused the Spartans to miss the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier. Any military activity during the festival was seen as sacrilege and forbidden by Spartan law. This had a huge impact on the Greek plans, as the Spartans were the ones in charge of the Greek defense by land, and the state were the largest army. Nevertheless, given the severity of the situation and the fact that the literal survival of Sparta was at stake, the Spartans were willing to make a compromise. 300 Spartans, including their ruler, King Leonidas, would head towards Thermopylae and lead the Greek defenders against the Achaemenid troops. This was a monumental sacrifice on behalf of the Spartans, not only because of their unwavering loyalty to their religious traditions, but because they were sending some of their best men, including their leader, to almost certain death. As the Greek forces took their defensive positions by land and by sea, the Persians made a final effort to resolve the conflict diplomatically, sending emissaries to negotiate a truce. The Persian diplomats received the same treatment as before. With the failure of the last Persian attempt to avoid bloodshed, a large-scale clash between the Persian and Greek armies was imminent. The Greek forces at Thermopylae numbered around 6,000 men according to Herodotus, with about half of them coming from the Peloponnese, and the other half joining the Peloponnesian forces along the way from various parts of mainland Greece. To say that the Greek troops were outnumbered is an understatement. The situation at sea did not look as dire for the Greeks, but they were still going to be at a heavy disadvantage. Before the Persian fleet arrived at Artemisium, where the Greeks had taken defensive positions, 2 consecutive days of heavy storms had sunk a sizable portion of it. Nevertheless, It is safe to assume that the approximately 300 Greek ships were outnumbered at least 3 to 1. 5 days after arriving at Thermopylae, Xerxes and his second-in-command, General Mardonius, decided that it was time to advance on the Greeks. As per usual, the Persian archers were sent in first to try to inflict damage on the Greek lines from a distance. Similar to Marathon, the Persian arrows did not manage to inflict any casualties on the well-armored Greek hoplites. Xerxes then decided that it was time to engage the Greeks head-on, sending his melee troops in combat, several thousand men at a time. Wave after wave, the Greeks managed to cut down some of the best soldiers that Xerxes had under his command, including many of the elite Persian immortals. At the Hot Gates, the first day of combat ended with a decisive Greek victory. At Artemisium, the Persians decided to split a portion of their fleet and send it around the Greek positions. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Persian navy moved in to engage the Greek ships. The Greeks, however, had a prearranged defensive formation designed to catch the Persians off guard. Upon seeing the Persian ships advance, the Greeks quickly executed the maneuver and managed to fight off the Persians, taking virtually no damage and sinking a small portion of the Persian fleet. The flanking detachment of the Persians was caught in another storm, driven off course, and took heavy casualties. The first naval engagement also ended with a Greek victory. Day 2 of the hostilities started largely as a repeat of Day 1. Xerxes sent in more of his troops to be cut down by the Greeks at Thermopylae, while at Artemisium the Persians were hesitant to send another attack, and were largely focused on salvaging and repairing their fleet after the losses taken the day before. In addition to this, the Greeks launched an attack on the remains of the Persian flanking detachment and managed to sink it, ending Day 2 in Greek victory as well. However, contemplating his next move, Xerxes learned of a secret path around Thermopylae, which could be used to attack the Greek positions from behind. This information was likely conveyed to him by a local Greek, who was offered a generous award for showing the Persians a secret passage. This was an extremely significant development, not only because it gave the Persians an opportunity to change their tactics and attack the Greeks in their flank, but because one of the main reasons the Greeks had chosen the Hot Gates as their defensive position was precisely the knowledge that the Persians were not aware of this path. In the early hours of Day 3, the remnants of the Persian immortals, alongside around 20,000 other troops, were sent through the newly discovered secret path. Upon learning that the Persians had launched an attack on their flank, the Greeks knew that the battle was lost. Many soldiers were given the opportunity to retreat and fight another day, but a portion of the Greek forces, including Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, stayed behind to fight to the death. Despite the Greeks being outflanked and severely outnumbered, the fighting continued for hours, with the Greeks fighting ferociously and inflicting further heavy casualties on the Persian army. At Artemisium, the Persians were ready to launch another attack on the Greek fleet. Wasting no time, they rushed head-on towards the Greeks, attempting to use their superior numbers to encircle them. The two fleets were engaged in combat all day, both sides taking heavy losses. Upon evaluating the damage at the end of the day, Themistocles and his fellow commanders decided that the risk of engaging the Persian fleet once again was too grave and decided to retreat. With the Persian victories at Thermopylae and Artemisium, the path to old Greece was wide open for Xerxes and his men. Nevertheless, the Achaemenid army had suffered heavy casualties both to their land and naval forces. The victory that the Persians gained at Thermopylae was a massively costly one. Xerxes' tactic of throwing his most experienced and valuable troops into battle first came with gravely consequences. The vast majority of his best soldiers lay dead at Thermopylae, meaning that his army, which was already significantly inferior to the Greeks in terms of quality, became even more so. In addition to this, the death of King Leonidas meant that a diplomatic solution was completely unattainable in the future, and the conflict had grown into a state of total war.